Richmond, Virginia, April 1865. The Confederate capital was falling. In the chaos of burning buildings and retreating soldiers, a woman in a tattered gray cloak slipped through the Union lines one final time. Her name was Sarah Ashmore, and she carried secrets that could change everything we thought we knew about the Civil War's final days. For 3 years, Sarah had been one of the Confederacy's most valuable assets, a spy operating deep in Union territory, sending intelligence that had saved thousands of Southern lives. But on that April night, she vanished completely. No body was ever found. No grave was ever marked. For 127 years, her fate remained one of the war's most haunting mysteries. Until 1992, when a construction crew renovating an old federal building in Washington, D.C. discovered something impossible, a sealed compartment behind a basement wall containing dozens of letters written in Sarah's hand. The dates on these letters ranged from April 1865 to November 1867, more than 2 years after she supposedly disappeared, and more than 2 years after the war had ended. What those letters revealed would force historians to rewrite an entire chapter of American history. If you're fascinated by forgotten mysteries of the Civil War, subscribe and hit that notification bell, because this story goes deeper than anyone imagined. Let's uncover what really happened to Sarah Ashmore. Chapter 1. The Belle of Baltimore. Sarah Catherine Ashmore was born in 1838 to one of Baltimore's most prominent merchant families. Her father, Thomas Ashmore, owned a fleet of ships that traded between Baltimore and Charleston, making the family wealthy but also placing them in an impossible position when the war began. Maryland remained in the Union, but the Ashmore family's sympathies and financial interests lay firmly with the South. Sarah grew up in a world of privilege and education unusual for women of her time. Her mother, who had been raised in Charleston, insisted that Sarah receive the same classical education as her brothers. By age 16, Sarah could read Latin and French, had studied European history and philosophy, and possessed a remarkable memory that would later prove invaluable in her espionage work. She could memorize entire pages of text after reading them just once, a talent that would allow her to carry intelligence without ever committing it to paper. When Fort Sumter fell in April 1861, Sarah was 22 years old, engaged to be married to a young lawyer named William Preston. William joined the Confederate Army within days, becoming a lieutenant in the 1st Maryland Infantry, CSA. Like thousands of other young men that spring, he believed the war would be over in months. He promised to return to Baltimore by Christmas to marry Sarah. William Preston died at Antietam on September 17, 1862. Sarah received the news 3 weeks later in a brief letter from William's commanding officer. There would be no body to bury. William had fallen during the desperate Confederate retreat through Sharpsburg, and his remains were never recovered from the battlefield. Sarah was devastated, but her grief soon transformed into something harder and more dangerous: determination. Through her father's business connections, Sarah made contact with Confederate intelligence officers operating in Baltimore. Maryland, though technically Union, was filled with Southern sympathizers who formed an extensive network of spies and couriers. Sarah volunteered her services, and her education, social position, and remarkable memory made her an ideal candidate. By November 1862, she had been recruited into one of the Confederacy's most sophisticated espionage rings. Her first assignment was simple: attend a social gathering at the home of a Union officer and remember everything she heard about troop movements around Fredericksburg. Sarah succeeded brilliantly, memorizing not just the general information, but specific numbers of regiments, artillery pieces, and supply wagons. The intelligence she provided helped Confederate General Stonewall Jackson position his forces for maximum advantage in the upcoming battle. When the Union Army attacked at Fredericksburg in December, they suffered one of their worst defeats of the war, in part because of what Sarah had overheard at a dinner party. For the next 2 years, Sarah operated with extraordinary skill and caution. She attended social events throughout Baltimore and Washington, using her charm and social position to gain access to Union officers and government officials. She never wrote anything down while in enemy territory. Instead, she would memorize everything, then travel to safe houses in rural Maryland, where she would transcribe the intelligence for Confederate couriers. Her reports covered everything from troop movements and supply routes to Union intelligence operations and even confidential conversations about war strategy. The danger was constant and real. Several members of her spy ring were arrested and imprisoned. 2 were executed. Union counterintelligence was becoming increasingly sophisticated, and by 1864, Sarah knew that suspicion was beginning to fall on her. Union officers still invited her to social gatherings, but she noticed subtle changes, conversations that stopped when she approached, careful glances from military policemen, questions about her family's business dealings that seemed designed to trap her. In March 1865, as the Confederacy was clearly collapsing, Sarah received urgent orders from her handlers, one final mission of critical importance. She was to travel to Washington, D.C., and gather any intelligence she could about Union plans for occupying and governing the South after the war ended. Confederate leaders, preparing for the possibility of continuing the war through guerrilla resistance, desperately needed to understand what the North intended to do with the defeated Southern states. Sarah accepted the mission, even though she knew it might be a death sentence. Richmond was about to fall. The Confederate intelligence network was disintegrating. If she was caught now, there would be no prisoner exchange, no possibility of escape. Union authorities would likely execute her as a spy without hesitation. But Sarah had lost everything to this war. Her fiancé, her innocence, 3 years of her youth spent in constant danger. She would see it through to the end, whatever that end might be. On April 2, 1865, Sarah Ashmore left Baltimore for Washington, D.C. She carried forged papers identifying her as a war widow seeking assistance from the Union government. She told her family she would return within a week. She never came home. Chapter 2. The Disappearance. The timing of Sarah's final mission could not have been worse. On April 2, 1865, the same day she arrived in Washington, Confederate forces abandoned Richmond and Petersburg. The Confederate government fled south, and Union troops occupied the smoldering ruins of the Confederate capital. The war was effectively over, though neither side knew it yet. Sarah checked into a modest boarding house on E Street, not far from Ford's Theater. Her cover story was simple but effective. She was Mrs. Sarah Preston, widow of a Confederate officer, seeking assistance from Union authorities to travel south to claim her late husband's property. It was a common enough story in those chaotic final weeks of war, and it gave her a reason to make inquiries at various government offices. For the first few days, Sarah's mission proceeded according to plan. She made contact with a Confederate sympathizer who worked as a clerk in the War Department, a man who had been feeding intelligence to the South throughout the war. Through him, she learned that the Union planned to implement a relatively moderate Reconstruction policy, at least initially. President Lincoln himself was advocating for quickly reintegrating the Southern states rather than punishing them harshly. But Sarah wanted more specific information. She needed to know about military occupation plans, about which Union commanders would govern which Southern states, about how Confederate political leaders would be treated. This information would be crucial for any organized Southern resistance that might continue after the formal surrender of the Confederate armies. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The news reached Washington that evening, triggering celebrations throughout the city. Sarah was attending a small gathering at the home of her War Department contact when someone burst in with the news. She watched Union supporters embrace and weep with joy, and she maintained her composure even as her world collapsed. The Confederacy was dead. Everything she had worked for, everything William had died for, was finished. But she still had her mission. In the jubilant chaos following Lee's surrender, security throughout Washington became surprisingly lax. Union officers who had been cautious and suspicious were now celebrating, drinking, letting their guard down. Sarah saw an opportunity. Over the next few days, she attended several parties and gatherings where liquor flowed freely, and Union officials talked openly about what would come next. What Sarah learned during those conversations was both hopeful and troubling. President Lincoln genuinely wanted a merciful peace, but many in his own government and party wanted to punish the South severely. There were debates about whether to try Confederate leaders for treason, about whether to confiscate Southern property, about whether to give freed slaves full political rights immediately. The future was uncertain, and different factions within the Union government were already maneuvering to shape what would come next. Sarah committed all of this to memory, planning to write a comprehensive report once she reached the safe house in Maryland, where she had delivered intelligence before. She made arrangements to leave Washington on April 15th. Then, on the evening of April 14th, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater, just blocks from Sarah's boarding house. The city exploded in rage and panic. Union soldiers sealed the streets, conducting house-to-house searches for anyone connected to the conspiracy. The assassin, John Wilkes Booth, was a well-known Confederate sympathizer, and Union authorities immediately suspected a broader Southern plot. Anyone with Confederate connections became suspect. Martial law was declared. Hundreds of people were arrested on the slightest suspicion. Sarah's boarding house was searched on April 16th. She was questioned extensively about her background, her reasons for being in Washington, her activities since arriving. Her papers were technically in order, but the investigating officer seemed suspicious. He told her not to leave the city and that she would be questioned again. Sarah knew she was in mortal danger. Even if her cover story held up, the Union authorities might decide to imprison her simply as a precaution. They were arresting Southern sympathizers wholesale, and if they investigated her background more carefully, if they talked to the wrong people in Baltimore, if someone recognized her from a social gathering where Union secrets had been discussed, she would almost certainly be executed. On the night of April 18th, Sarah fled her boarding house. She left behind all her belongings, except what she could carry in a small bag. She had no clear plan except to somehow reach Confederate territory, except that Confederate territory no longer existed. The Confederacy had collapsed. Where could she even run to? According to official records, Sarah Catherine Ashmore disappeared that night and was never seen again. Union authorities questioned her family in Baltimore, searched her father's business records, and monitored Confederate courier routes she might have used. Nothing. She had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed her whole. For the next 127 years, Civil War historians occasionally mentioned Sarah Ashmore as a footnote, one of many Confederate spies whose fate remained unknown. A few researchers tried to track her down, but the trail was impossibly cold. Most assumed she had died during her escape attempt, probably killed by Union patrols or by simple misfortune. Some speculated that she might have made it south and lived out her life under an assumed name. But without evidence, her story remained a minor mystery, interesting but unsolvable. Until that construction crew in 1992 broke through a basement wall in a building on Pennsylvania Avenue and found the letters. Chapter 3. The Hidden Room. The building at 412 Pennsylvania Avenue, NW, had been many things over its long history. Built in 1858, it had served as a warehouse, a government office building, a telegraph station during the Civil War, and finally a storage facility for the National Archives. By 1992, it was slated for renovation and conversion into modern office space. On March 17, 1992, a construction foreman named Robert Chen was overseeing the demolition of interior walls in the basement when his crew discovered something unusual. Behind what appeared to be a load-bearing brick wall, their equipment detected a hollow space. This wasn't uncommon in buildings of that era. False walls and hidden spaces were sometimes created to accommodate plumbing or ventilation added years after original construction. But when they carefully removed some bricks to investigate, they found something no one expected. A small, sealed room, approximately 6 feet by 8 feet, that didn't appear on any of the building's architectural plans. The room's entrance had been bricked up from the outside, and the mortar was clearly very old. The bricks themselves were of a type manufactured in the 1860s. When the crew finally broke through, they found themselves looking into a space that had been sealed for over a century. The room was almost empty. There was no furniture, no decoration, just bare walls and floor. But in one corner, protected from moisture by what appeared to be waxed canvas, was a wooden box. Robert Chen, who was a Civil War buff, immediately recognized that something significant had been discovered and called his supervisor. Within hours, representatives from the National Archives and the Smithsonian were on site. The wooden box was carefully removed and taken to a conservation laboratory. When archivists finally opened it under controlled conditions, they found it contained dozens of letters, all written on aged paper in a clear, feminine hand. The letters were remarkably well preserved, protected by the canvas wrapping and the sealed environment of the hidden room. The first letter was dated April 21st, 1865, just 1 week after Lincoln's assassination, and 3 days after Sarah Ashmore had disappeared from her Washington boarding house. It began, "My name is Sarah Catherine Ashmore, and I am writing this from behind enemy lines, where I expect to remain until this terrible war truly ends. If you are reading this, then I have likely perished, and these words are all that remain of my story." The archivists quickly realized they had found something extraordinary. They contacted Civil War historians, who confirmed that Sarah Ashmore had indeed been a documented Confederate spy who had disappeared in Washington in April 1865. But the letters raised more questions than they answered. If Sarah had been in hiding in Washington, why hadn't she tried to escape? How had she survived in a sealed room? And most puzzling, the letters continued far beyond April 1865. The last letter in the box was dated November 15th, 1867, more than 2.5 years after the war ended, and more than 2 years after Sarah supposedly disappeared. The implications were staggering. If the letters were genuine, Sarah Ashmore had somehow remained hidden in Washington for years after the war, living in conditions that must have been nearly unbearable, continuing to write letters that she somehow hoped would one day be found and read. But why? What could have kept her in hiding for so long after the war ended? Why didn't she simply emerge once the immediate danger passed, and perhaps most mysteriously? The letters suggested she wasn't alone. Dr. Patricia Morrison, a Civil War historian specializing in espionage, was brought in to authenticate the letters and piece together their story. She spent months analyzing the documents, comparing the handwriting to verified samples of Sarah's writing, testing the paper and ink to confirm they were period-appropriate, and cross-referencing the contents with known historical events to check for anachronisms. Everything checked out. The letters were genuine, the handwriting matched, the paper and ink were authentic to the 1860s. More remarkably, the letters contained information about events and people that would have been impossible for a forger to know. Specific details about minor government officials, descriptions of Washington life in the immediate post-war period, references to temporary regulations and bureaucratic changes that were never well documented and only confirmed through painstaking research in obscure government records. Dr. Morrison concluded that the letters were almost certainly genuine documents written by Sarah Ashmore between 1865 and 1867. Which meant that everything historians thought they knew about Sarah's fate was wrong. She hadn't died in April 1865. She had survived, hidden somewhere in Washington for at least 2.5 years. And the letters told the story of those lost years. a story of survival, desperation, loyalty, and ultimately tragedy that no one could have imagined. Chapter 4. In the Shadow of the Telegraph. The first letter, dated April 21st, 1865, explained how Sarah came to be in hiding. After fleeing her boarding house on the night of April 18th, she had made her way through the darkened streets of Washington, avoiding Union patrols and checkpoints. She had no clear destination. She only knew she couldn't stay at the boarding house and couldn't leave the city, which was effectively under martial law. In desperation, she sought out the War Department clerk who had been her contact, the Confederate sympathizer who had been feeding her intelligence. His name was Marcus Webb, a 43-year-old career bureaucrat who had worked in various government positions since before the war. Webb had never expected to become a spy. His Southern sympathies were sincere but abstract, based on states' rights principles rather than any personal connection to the South. But he had been recruited into the Confederate intelligence network early in the war, and he had served faithfully, if nervously, ever since. When Sarah appeared at his door that night, terrified and desperate, Webb faced an impossible choice. Harboring a known Confederate spy was a hanging offense, especially now with Lincoln's assassins still at large and Washington in a state of paranoid fury. But Webb couldn't bring himself to turn her away. He brought her into his home and promised to help her hide until it was safe to leave the city. But it never became safe. The manhunt for John Wilkes Booth and his co-conspirators continued for weeks. Union authorities conducted repeated searches and interrogations. Anyone with Confederate connections was scrutinized mercilessly. Several members of the Washington spy ring were arrested and imprisoned. Webb himself was questioned twice, and he knew he was under suspicion. It was Webb who conceived of the hiding place. The building on Pennsylvania Avenue housed a telegraph station and War Department offices. Webb had access to the building as part of his job. More importantly, he knew about the basement, a warren of storage rooms and utility spaces that few people ever visited. He also knew that one section of the basement had been sealed off years earlier due to structural concerns. It would be possible, with careful work done at night when the building was mostly empty, to create a hidden space where Sarah could remain undetected. Over the course of several nights in late April, Webb carefully removed bricks from an interior wall, creating an opening into the sealed section of the basement. He smuggled in supplies, blankets, candles, food, water, a chamber pot. He created a hiding place that Sarah could access through a removable section of wall. It was cramped, dark, and airless, but it was safe. Union soldiers searching the building would find nothing unusual, just a sealed basement with structural damage, exactly as the building plans indicated. Sarah moved into her hiding place on April 25, 1865. Webb told her it would only be for a few weeks, just until the immediate crisis passed and security loosened. Then they could arrange for her to leave Washington with forged papers, perhaps traveling south to where her father's business still had contacts. But weeks turned into months. The conspiracy trials dragged on through the summer. 4 of Booth's co-conspirators were hanged in July. Union authorities remained vigilant, continuing to monitor anyone with Confederate connections. Webb's own position became increasingly precarious as the government reorganized and new officials arrived who didn't know him. He couldn't risk drawing attention to himself by trying to obtain forged papers or make travel arrangements for Sarah. In her letters, Sarah described the reality of her existence during those months. She lived in total darkness most of the time. Candles were dangerous because of the smoke, which might be detected. She had no natural light, no way to tell day from night except when Webb visited, usually late at night when the building was empty. He brought food, water, and news from the outside world. He removed her waste and brought fresh supplies. These visits were her only connection to the world beyond her prison. The space was approximately 6 feet by 8 feet, about the size of a small bathroom. Sarah couldn't stand fully upright because of the low ceiling. She slept on blankets on the floor. She had no books, no work to occupy her hands or mind. She couldn't make noise for fear of detection. There were offices directly above her, and during the day she could hear footsteps, voices, and the clicking of the telegraph machines. To maintain her sanity, Sarah began writing letters. Webb brought her paper, pen, and ink, luxuries, but necessary to preserve her mental health. She wrote to her dead fiancé, William, describing her situation and her feelings. She wrote to her parents, even though she could never send the letters. She wrote to herself, documenting her days in hiding, recording her thoughts and memories and fears. Writing became her lifeline, the thing that kept her mind from fracturing under the strain of solitary confinement. The most remarkable aspect of the early letters is their tone. Despite her desperate circumstances, Sarah remained rational, determined, and even hopeful. She understood that Webb was risking his life to keep her safe. She was grateful for his help. She believed that eventually, perhaps in 6 months, perhaps in a year, she would be able to emerge and rebuild her life. The war was over. The crisis would pass. She just had to endure. But as summer turned to fall and fall to winter, Sarah's letters began to change. The hope began to fade, replaced by a growing understanding that her imprisonment might not be temporary. Webb was increasingly worried about his own safety. Several of his colleagues had been arrested or dismissed under suspicion of Confederate sympathies. He told Sarah that it might be years before it was safe for her to emerge. The government was creating files on thousands of suspected Confederate sympathizers, and Sarah's name was almost certainly in those files. By December 1865, 8 months into her captivity, Sarah wrote, "I begin to understand that this may be my life now. Not a temporary hiding place, but a tomb where I will remain until I die or until Marcus is arrested and I am discovered. I try not to think about which would be worse." Chapter 5. The Long Captivity. The winter of 1865-1866 was the darkest period of Sarah's imprisonment, both literally and figuratively. Webb's visits became less frequent as security in the building tightened and his own position became more precarious. There were weeks when he could only visit once or twice, leaving Sarah with barely enough food and water to survive. She rationed her supplies carefully, never knowing when he would return. The cold was brutal, the basement was unheated, and Sarah had only blankets for warmth. She described sleeping in all the clothes Webb had been able to smuggle to her, wrapped in every blanket, still shivering through the night. She developed a persistent cough that lasted for months. Her letters from this period are shorter, as if she lacked the energy or warmth to write extensively. But Sarah also demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. She developed routines to structure her days and maintain her mental health. She exercised as much as possible in the confined space, doing stretches and movements to keep her body from weakening. She memorized poetry and recited it aloud in a whisper. All the verses she had learned as a girl, plus new verses she composed herself. She created elaborate fantasies about her life after release, planning in minute detail what she would do, where she would go, how she would rebuild. Webb brought her books when he could, smuggled in one at a time. Sarah read each one dozens of times, memorizing passages, analyzing the text from every angle. She mentioned reading David Copperfield, Pride and Prejudice, and several volumes of poetry. These books became precious to her, companions in her solitude, windows to worlds beyond her dark prison. The relationship between Sarah and Webb evolved during this period in ways that neither could have anticipated. Webb's initial motivation had been partly chivalry, partly political loyalty to the Confederate cause he had secretly served. But as months passed and his visits continued, a deeper connection developed. Sarah was completely dependent on him, but she was also his confidant, the only person to whom he could speak honestly about his fears, his regrets, his growing disillusionment with the cause he had served. Webb confessed in several conversations, which Sarah recorded in her letters, that he had come to see the war and his role in it very differently. He no longer believed the South had been right to secede. He was disturbed by what he learned about slavery from freed blacks now working in government buildings. He questioned the political principles that had seemed so important to him before the war. Yet he continued to risk everything to protect Sarah, not because of political loyalty anymore, but because of personal loyalty, because abandoning her now would be a betrayal worse than any political apostasy. For her part, Sarah's feelings toward Webb were complex and evolved over time. She was deeply grateful to him, but she also recognized the strange power dynamic of their relationship. She was completely in his power, dependent on him for every necessity of life. She worried constantly that he would tire of the burden, that he would decide the risk was too great, that one night he simply wouldn't come back. Yet she also grew to trust him in ways she had never trusted anyone before. He was the only person who knew where she was, the only person who could save her. Her life was literally in his hands every day. By spring 1866, nearly a year into her captivity, Sarah's letters reveal a significant shift in her perspective. She stopped writing about when she would be released and started writing about how to endure indefinitely. She accepted that this might be her life for years, perhaps forever. The acceptance brought a strange kind of peace. If this was to be her fate, then she would find meaning in it. She would survive. She would maintain her humanity. She would not let the darkness destroy her mind or spirit. She also began to write more analytically about the war, about the causes she had served, about whether any of it had been worth the terrible cost. These passages are among the most philosophically interesting in the collection. Sarah had been an ardent Confederate partisan, motivated by personal grief and political conviction. But isolation and time gave her space to reconsider, to see the war from different angles, to question the certainties that had once seemed absolute. She never fully renounced the Confederate cause. She still believed in states' rights and still honored the memory of William and others who had died. But she came to see slavery as indefensible and secession as a tragic mistake. She wrote, "We fought for principles we believed were righteous. But we built those principles on a foundation of sin, and perhaps God has judged us accordingly. I served my cause faithfully, but I no longer know if that cause deserved such faithful service." These philosophical reflections made her captivity more bearable. Instead of simply enduring, she was thinking, processing, growing. The letters from this period are remarkably mature and insightful, showing a depth of thought that would have done credit to any historian or philosopher. Summer 1866 brought new challenges. The building underwent renovations that summer, with workers in and out daily. For weeks, Sarah had to remain absolutely silent, barely moving, as construction workers labored in rooms near her hiding place. Webb couldn't visit at all during this period. The building was too active, the risk of detection too high. Sarah survived on provisions left before the renovations began, rationing her water and food to make them last. She described this period as the most terrifying of her captivity. Any loud noise from the workers might have been them discovering her hiding place. Every day she expected the wall to come down and her imprisonment to end in discovery and probable execution. But somehow the renovations were completed without anyone finding the hidden room. When Webb finally visited again in early August, Sarah broke down completely, weeping in a way she hadn't allowed herself to do before. The strain had nearly broken her. By fall 1866, 18 months into her captivity, Sarah's handwriting in the letters began to show subtle changes. It remained legible and controlled, but less fluid than before. She mentioned in several letters that her hands cramped from the cold and damp, and that she was having difficulty with fine motor control. She was also developing health problems, chronic pain in her back and legs from the cramped quarters, persistent respiratory issues from the damp air and lack of fresh circulation, deteriorating teeth from poor nutrition. Webb tried to help, bringing what medicines he could, but resources were limited and the risk of arousing suspicion was always present. Sarah bore her physical decline stoically, mentioning it in her letters primarily as an objective fact rather than a complaint. But reading between the lines, it's clear that by late 1866, her health was seriously compromised. The letters from this period also reveal that Sarah and Webb had begun to plan for various contingencies. They discussed what would happen if Webb died or was arrested. Sarah had a small knife that Webb had given her. She wrote matter-of-factly that she would use it on herself rather than face capture and execution. They discussed whether Webb should try to kill her quickly and mercifully if he learned his arrest was imminent, to spare her a slower death from starvation and thirst. These were not morbid fantasies, but practical planning for real possibilities. Yet even in this darkest period, moments of humanity and even beauty shine through in the letters. Webb brought Sarah a small flower once, a rose from a street vendor. She kept it until it crumbled to dust, treasuring it as a connection to the world of light and life above. She described the sound of rain on the building above her as a symphony, a reminder that the natural world continues even in this unnatural place. She found meaning and beauty wherever she could, refusing to let her spirit be entirely crushed by her circumstances. By early 1867, Sarah had been in hiding for nearly 2 years. The letters from this period show both deterioration and resilience. Her physical condition was declining. She mentioned periods of fever, persistent cough, and times when she was too weak to do more than lie on her blankets. But her mental clarity remained sharp, and her will to survive remained strong. She had endured this long. She would continue to endure. What she couldn't have known was that her ordeal was approaching its final act, and that the ending would be even more tragic than anyone could have imagined. Chapter 6. The Final Letters. The last phase of Sarah's captivity began with an unexpected development. In March 1867, Webb told Sarah that he was being transferred to a different department. The reorganization of the government following the war meant that his position was being eliminated and he was being reassigned to work in a different building. He would no longer have easy access to Sarah's hiding place. Webb and Sarah faced an agonizing choice. He could try to move her to a new hiding place, but that would mean smuggling her out of the building and into a new location, extraordinarily risky and likely impossible. He could help her emerge from hiding with forged papers and a new identity, but the risk of recognition or capture remained high. Or he could try to continue visiting her in the old building, but without legitimate reason to be there, he would eventually be questioned and possibly discovered. They decided on a modified version of the third option. Webb would continue to visit Sarah, but less frequently, perhaps once a week instead of several times per week. He would claim business that occasionally brought him to the old building if anyone questioned his presence. Sarah would need to ration her supplies more carefully and endure longer periods alone. But it seemed like the safest option available. The letters from spring and summer 1867 document the growing strain of this new arrangement. Webb's visits became irregular, sometimes weekly. Sometimes longer gaps appeared. Sarah mentioned going 4 days without water at one point, sucking moisture from damp stones in the wall to survive. Her physical condition deteriorated rapidly. She mentioned persistent fever, delirium, and periods where she lost track of time entirely. But what makes these final letters most remarkable is not the physical suffering, but the emotional depth. Sarah knew she was dying. Her body was failing after more than 2 years in darkness, damp, and deprivation. Yet her letters remained articulate, thoughtful, and even graceful. She seemed determined to leave a record not just of her suffering, but of her humanity. On July 15, 1867, Sarah wrote what may be the most moving letter in the collection. "I have had much time to think about whether my life had meaning, whether my choices were right, whether God will judge me harshly for the things I have done. I was a spy. I contributed to the deaths of Union soldiers by the intelligence I gathered. I served a cause that defended human bondage. These are facts I cannot escape. Yet I also loved truly, served faithfully, and endured with whatever grace I could muster. Perhaps that is all any of us can do. Make our choices, face the consequences, and hope that the good outweighs the evil in the final accounting. The last few letters reveal that Webb was also deteriorating under the strain. He had sacrificed his career prospects, his peace of mind, and increasingly his health to keep Sarah alive. The stress was destroying him. Sarah worried about him in her letters, expressing guilt that her survival was costing him so much. She suggested several times that he should abandon her, that he had done enough, that she didn't want his death or imprisonment on her conscience. Webb refused. In September 1867, Webb became seriously ill. Sarah's letters mention that he told her he had contracted pneumonia. His visits became even less frequent. Sarah understood that the end was approaching, one way or another. Either Webb would die and she would starve, or she would die first, or they would both die in their different prisons, he of disease, she of starvation and despair. The penultimate letter, dated October 28, 1867, describes Webb's last visit. He was barely able to walk, clearly very ill. He brought what supplies he could and told Sarah he didn't think he would be able to visit again soon. They both knew what that meant. Sarah wrote, "We said goodbye as if we were old friends parting after a pleasant visit, both pretending we would see each other again soon, both knowing we were lying." Marcus wept when he left. I did not. I had no tears left to give. But I held his hand and told him that he had saved my life, and that whatever happened next, I would die grateful for his kindness. I hope he believed me. The final letter in the collection is dated November 15, 1867, 18 days after Webb's last visit. It's written in a shaky hand, quite different from Sarah's usually controlled script. Parts of it are difficult to read, whether from poor handwriting or deterioration of the paper, but the message is clear enough. "This will be my last letter. I have no water left and no strength to endure much longer. Marcus has not come, and I believe he will not come again. I hope he is alive and well, though I suspect he may have died. And if so, I will follow him soon into whatever comes after this life. I am not afraid. I have lived in darkness for so long that the final darkness holds no terror. I leave these letters as a record of my time in this place, and as testament that I survived with my mind intact and my humanity preserved. I served my cause, I honored my love, I endured my punishment, and I face my death with what little courage remains. May God grant me peace, and may whoever finds these words remember that I was here, that I lived, that I mattered." Sarah Catherine Ashmore, November 15, 1867. The letter ends there, mid-page, as if Sarah lacked the strength to continue. Historical research conducted after the discovery of the letters confirmed many of Sarah's details. Marcus Webb did indeed work in the War Department during and after the Civil War. Records show he was transferred to a different position in March 1867, exactly as Sarah described. More significantly, Marcus Webb died on October 15, 1867, just 13 days before Sarah's final letter describing his last visit. The timing suggests that Webb made his final visit to Sarah while already gravely ill, within days of his own death. Webb died alone in a boarding house, officially of pneumonia, though the death certificate notes complications from prolonged nervous exhaustion. He was 45 years old, he had no family, and his few possessions were sold to pay his debts. There was no indication in any of his papers that he had been harboring a Confederate spy for more than 2 years. If he kept any records of his activities, they were destroyed before his death. As for Sarah herself, she simply disappeared from the historical record after April 18, 1865. Her family searched for her for years. Her father hired private investigators and made inquiries throughout the South and in Washington, but they found nothing. Sarah's mother died in 1873, still not knowing what had become of her daughter. Her father died in 1881, taking his grief and questions to the grave. When Sarah's body was finally discovered in 1992, forensic examination confirmed that the skeletal remains found in the hidden room were those of a woman in her late 20s, consistent with Sarah's age in 1867. The cause of death was determined to be a combination of dehydration, malnutrition, and respiratory failure. Exactly what one would expect from someone who had endured more than 2 years in such conditions. The remains were given a proper burial in Baltimore's Greenmount Cemetery in 1994 in a ceremony attended by historians, Civil War enthusiasts, and descendants of Sarah's family. A simple headstone marks the grave. Sarah Catherine Ashmore, 1838-1867. Confederate spy. She endured. The discovery of Sarah's letters forced a reevaluation of several aspects of Civil War history. They provided unprecedented insight into the operations of Confederate intelligence networks in Washington, including details about other spies and methods that had never been documented. They offered a unique perspective on Washington in the immediate post-war period, described from a vantage point no other source could provide. And they raised troubling questions about how many other Confederate agents might have disappeared in similar circumstances, dying alone and forgotten in hiding places that were never discovered. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the historian who authenticated the letters, spent years analyzing them and wrote a comprehensive study titled Letters from Darkness: The Hidden Testimony of Sarah Ashmore. In the book's introduction, she wrote, "Sarah's letters give voice to one of the countless individuals whose lives were destroyed by the Civil War in ways that never made it into official histories. She was not a battlefield casualty, not a civilian caught in the crossfire, but something else entirely. A woman who voluntarily entered the shadows to serve her cause and who was ultimately trapped there by circumstances beyond her control. Her letters are a monument to human endurance, a meditation on loyalty and sacrifice, and a reminder that war's cruelties extend far beyond the battlefield." The building at 412 Pennsylvania Avenue was ultimately demolished in 1995, but the hidden room where Sarah spent her final years was carefully documented and photographed before the demolition. A portion of the wall, including some of Sarah's carved marks — she had scratched lines to count the days, though she eventually lost track — was preserved and is now part of a Civil War exhibit at the Smithsonian. Sarah's letters themselves are housed in the National Archives, available to researchers by appointment. They have been digitized and portions are available online, though out of respect for Sarah's privacy and dignity, some of the more personal passages, particularly those describing her physical deterioration and suffering, are restricted. The story of Sarah Ashmore raises profound questions about loyalty, sacrifice, and the human cost of war. She chose to serve the Confederate cause, knowing the risks. She accepted a dangerous mission during the war's final days, motivated by a mixture of political conviction and personal grief. When circumstances trapped her in an impossible situation, she endured with remarkable courage and dignity. Marcus Webb, a man who had betrayed his government to serve the Confederacy, spent the last years of his life in an act of almost unimaginable mercy, sacrificing his career, his health, and ultimately his life to keep one woman alive. Were their choices right? That's a question that cannot be answered simply. Sarah served a cause that defended slavery, a moral stain that cannot be erased by her personal courage or suffering. Webb betrayed the government he had sworn to serve, contributing to a war that killed hundreds of thousands. Yet both demonstrated a capacity for loyalty, sacrifice, and compassion that commands respect, even while their political choices invite condemnation. Perhaps the real lesson of Sarah's letters is not about the rightness or wrongness of her cause, but about the complexity of human beings caught in impossible historical circumstances. Sarah was not simply a Confederate spy or a tragic victim. She was a fully realized human being with intelligence, courage, doubt, love, and despair. Her letters allow us to see her as she saw herself, flawed, complicated, and ultimately human. In one of her letters from early 1867, Sarah wrote something that might serve as her epitaph. "I do not know if my life will be remembered, or if these letters will ever be read. But I have lived according to my understanding of duty and honor, even when that understanding led me into darkness. I have loved and been loved. I have suffered and endured. I have thought deeply about the meaning of my choices. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all we can ask of any life, that it be lived with intention, examined with honesty, and concluded with dignity." More than 125 years after her death, Sarah Ashmore's words finally reached the light. Her story, hidden so long in darkness, has become part of the historical record. The woman who disappeared behind enemy lines in April 1865 has been found at last, not alive, as her family hoped, but preserved in her own words, speaking to us across the gulf of more than a century about courage, endurance, and the terrible human cost of war. The letters remind us that history is not just about great battles and famous leaders, but about individual human beings, their choices, their struggles, their private heroisms, and their hidden tragedies. Sarah Ashmore was one person among millions whose lives were transformed or destroyed by the Civil War. But because she left her testimony behind, carefully preserved in a hidden room, her voice can still be heard. She endured in darkness, but her words emerged into light. And in that emergence, she achieved a kind of immortality that neither she nor Marcus Webb could have imagined during those long, dark years beneath Pennsylvania Avenue. Her story is finally told. Her sacrifice is finally acknowledged. Sarah Catherine Ashmore, Confederate spy, prisoner, and witness to her own slow dying, has been found. And in finding her, we find another piece of the vast, complex, tragic story of the American Civil War, a reminder that every war, no matter how necessary or justified, extracts costs that can never fully be calculated and leaves wounds that take generations to discover and understand. If you found Sarah's story as haunting and compelling as we did, please like this video and subscribe for more forgotten stories from American history. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Sarah made the right choices? Could Marcus have done anything differently? What other Civil War mysteries would you like us to investigate? Thank you for watching, and remember, history isn't just dates and battles. It's the stories of real people whose voices still echo across the years, waiting to be heard.